is where we're at today. Going to be looking at the fall. And this deals with chapters 3, 4, and 5. We will not get through all 3 chapters today, but we'll hopefully get through chapter 3 at least. If you can think back to a moment in your life, or maybe a recent moment in your life in which you were probably in front of a group of people or around people maybe you neither knew or did not know, and you were walking somewhere, maybe going into a store, maybe walking into a gas station, whatever the case may be, and you caught your foot on the curb or caught your foot on a rug that you didn't know was there, and you stumbled and you fell. I'll think back to a moment probably in time of our life that's happened, and how the instant reaction to that for us is what? Right, yeah, we're embarrassed, right? We're embarrassed. And even somebody, I don't really embarrass easy, but if I fall somewhere, I'm probably going to be a little bit embarrassed, especially if I'm around people that I don't know very well. And I think we all would agree with that it's an embarrassing thing to happen, right? Because, and why is that an embarrassing thing for us?
Show you vulnerability where you not got control or something.
Exactly, right? It shows how you're vulnerable, that you've lost control of something of yourself, essentially. The fact you can walk around, we can kind of take pride in the fact that we can walk around and we trip and fall on something because maybe we were talking or just simply weren't paying attention. It kind of shows that, we're a little bit careless sometimes maybe, or just kind of mind was off somewhere else, and falling down in front of people is embarrassing. And I think we all can agree with that, and we understand why it's so embarrassing when we fall. None of us likes to fall in public because our egos become bruised, right? We become foolish. Our bodies sometimes become bruised as well from the fall. And a lot of times, I guess if some people who embarrass more easily than others, it takes some time to kind of get over that, right? It takes some time to kind of get through that embarrassment. Some people can kind of shake it off and go on, but some people it takes a little longer to kind of get over those embarrassments. And we're going to talk about a fall today. Of course, eventually we get over the embarrassment of the fall. The fall that we're going to talk about today, there's no getting over it, right? There's no getting over it at all. It's a permanent black eye on Adam and Eve, right, for eternity. It has been an embarrassment to them. So we're going to look at the fall of humanity today. And of course, we know this story very well. But we're going to look more or less at not so much the fact that they fell, but what the fall cost them and what the fall cost us. Of course, it caused much more than just temporary embarrassment, right, or a temporary bruise to their ego. It cost a bruised heel, which we'll learn more about that bruised heel today, and it's much more serious than, I guess, simply a simple fall that we would kind of have, that we have all kind of dealt with. Okay, so look at chapter 3, and let's look at the first 5 verses. And we'll see here that, of course, Adam and Eve, remember up to this point, up to chapter 2, we don't know, there's not a timeline here for us for how long Adam and Eve were in the garden, okay? I'm sure there were at least a couple of days, because we know that God was coming down and walking with them in the evenings, right? So this wasn't like the very first day that God put them there. He's named the animals. That would have taken him some time. He has done some other work there in the garden as well. So this wasn't just God created Adam and then the next next day they sin, right? There is a period of time here. We don't know exactly what this period of time is. But there was a period of time here in which they were enjoying and living in this perfect utopia that God had given them. And as we read through verses 1 through 5 here of chapter 3, we're going to see that God very plainly and simply states the report here of our first parents and their willful disobedience and their willful plunge into sin. Okay, and we're going to look over in the New Testament as well to kind of confirm some of this, the same account that is in Genesis. So let's read these first 5 verses here of Genesis chapter 3. Now the serpent was more subtle than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And he said unto the woman, Yea, hath God said, Ye shall not eat of every tree of the garden. And the woman said unto the serpent, We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God hath said, Ye shall not eat of it, neither shall ye touch it, lest ye die. Let's stop right there for just a second, all right? We know the story very well. Satan, disguised as a serpent, a snake, that old sneaky snake, comes up to Eve and essentially asks her, what did God say that you could eat? Okay, and I want to stop because there's no confusion here whatsoever on Eve's part. Right? We see that in verse 3, she knows the parameters. Okay, she's fully aware of what the rules that have been set in place for them. Right? She tells the serpent that she's talking to that God essentially, God has said we can eat of every tree in the garden except for the one that He told us not to. She was very aware of the rules, fully aware. There was no confusion here. She now spent evenings, probably several evenings with God, walking in the evening like we know that He did. And so the rules, the guidelines here are very straightforward. There's no gray area here, right? Don't eat of the tree. And she knows that. She's fully aware of that, as you see in verse 3. And the serpent said unto the woman here in verse 4, Ye shall not surely die. For God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. So Satan, the tempter, used a serpent, and the serpent as described here in verse 1 of chapter 3. What's the description that is used here of the serpent?
Satan.
What?
He's more sneaky.
He's the sneakiest snake of all the other animals in the kingdom, right? There's nothing more subtle. There is no other animal that is as subtle and as sneaky as this serpent that is there. More subtle than any of the beasts of the field. And of course, we know that Satan takes the form of this serpent to deceive Eve. All right, and the serpent who shows up to Eve and comes up to her. Walks up to her, essentially, as we'll talk about here in a little bit, seemingly very innocently just kind of asks Eve this question, right? I'm sure this was just a very innocent question that the serpent walked up and mentioned this to Eve. Of course, this very innocent question had some pretty sinister results. And the serpent knew, of course, exactly what he was doing. Satan knew exactly what he was doing. But the question here, which seems innocent enough, what did God tell you that you could do? It's essentially insinuating or planting the seeds of doubt here that God could not be trusted, right? That's what Satan does here with Eve. Plants the seeds of doubt that God can't be trusted. Eve, God told you not to eat of that tree because He doesn't want you to be like Him, right? We see there in verse 5. The serpent says, verse 4, right after Eve tells him, God says we can't eat of this tree because as soon as we eat of the tree, we're going to die. And the serpent takes that statement that Eve says and says unto her, you're not going to die when you eat the fruit, right? God just doesn't want you to eat the fruit because He doesn't want your eyes to be open. He doesn't want you to be like Him. He doesn't want you to be like Him and know the stuff that He knows and knowing good from evil. So the serpent uses the seeds of doubt here in Eve's, to plant these in Eve's mind to insinuate that God could not be trusted. Now, we can go over this with a microscope and go in all of the different instances here in which Eve really messed up. Okay? She should have never even probably talked to the serpent. And then when the serpent asked the question, she should have said, I can't eat of that one, and she should have walked away. When he started trying to plant the seeds of doubt and trying to put the fact that God couldn't be trusted, all she would essentially had to do was look around at the creation that God had given them and go away from this serpent, right? We can go over with a microscope and see all of the instances here where Eve messed up. And we can judge her and kind of chastise her for listening to this snake that talked to her. None of the other animals, I'm sure, were talking to her. The snake, now, something's going on here. Is questioning the abilities, questioning what God had kind of told them. We can go over all those things, right? We can probably 50 different instances here where Eve made mistakes. The fact of the matter is that any of us in the same situation would have done the exact same thing. Okay? Here's Eve, the smartest woman to have ever lived. There is a whole bunch of intelligence in this room right now. Our combined intelligence is nowhere close to what Eve's was. Okay? Smartest person to ever live. Her and Adam and Eve both. They were made perfect. They had to have been. All right? Even her, smartest woman alive to ever live, was duped and deceived and tempted and tricked by this snake. All right? And we can go over all these different instances, but any of us in that same situation would have done the exact same thing. Okay? So insinuation here, the serpent Satan is trying to raise doubt. Doubt is a dangerous thing for anybody. It's an extremely dangerous thing for Christians. All right, when we begin to doubt God, we begin then to lose our faith in God. And when we lose our faith in God, what He can do for us, then we don't allow Him to control and lead, guide, and direct in our lives. Right? That's exactly what happens. When we begin to doubt God's rules, we begin to doubt God's plan for our lives, then we try to put our own situations or our own mindset or our own decisions and make our own decisions, and then that causes us to have problems. Doubt is a very, very dangerous thing. Satan knows that. Satan knows what doubt can do, and that's exactly what he does here to Eve. Go with me, please, to Romans chapter 5. And verse 12, 13, and 14. I've got a couple of the passages we're going to look at here. Romans chapter 5, verses 12 through 14. And it says this, wherefore as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin, so death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned. For until the law, sin was in the world, but sin is not imputed when there is no law. Nevertheless, death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over them that had not sinned, after the similitude of Adam's transgression, who is in figure of him that was to come. Flip also, please, over to 1 Corinthians. And go to chapter 15. And somebody will read verses 21 and 22.
For since by being dead, by man came also the resurrection of the dead. For as in Adam all died, even so in Christ shall all be made alive.
So we see another here, it's a good way to put it, another instance where the New Testament kind of reassures or talks about the fall or confirms the account here. Go to 1 Timothy and go to chapter 2. And when somebody gets there, read verses 13 and 14. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 13 and 14.
husband was first formed, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived was in the transgression.
So we see again the confirmation here of this account in the New Testament from the Old Testament of this snake, sneaky old snake, walked up and tried to and did convince Eve of some things that were placed some doubt in her mind. Satan, of course, knew, right, that God had forbidden the fruit of only one tree, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. What he again was doing was he was raising in the mind of Eve some doubt about the fairness of God. Right? It's one of the things that even as older kids that I deal with a lot when they don't want to do something that I need them to do, and then I give them some consequences for not following through. One of the first things they reply with is, "That's not fair." Right? That's not fair. This, whatever the case to be, I don't want to do this, or I don't think that's right. That's not fair. And that's the same doubt here, the same argument that Satan is trying to raise in Eve's mind is God's fairness. Now, let's make this very clear. God's not fair, right? There's no such thing as fairness in the eyes of God. God's just, and He's right, and what He says He is. It's black and white. Don't do it or do it. The consequences are this, okay? Our idea of fairness is not bound to God in no way whatsoever. But the serpent here, Satan, is planning in Eve's mind, why did He make this huge environment for you? Why did He make this perfect utopia that you can live in? And why would He place any restrictions on it? He made it perfect just for you and just for your husband, and He's allowed you to do all these things, but why place any restrictions on it at all? You should have no restrictions in this perfect utopia that God has given you. You should be able to do exactly whatever you want to do, and there should be no consequences or nothing that you should be in line that you should have to walk whatsoever. Okay? Satan was making one tree, the tree that they weren't supposed to eat of, more important to Eve than all of the other trees that were in the garden. Right? We mentioned this last week. The fruit that was on the tree of knowledge of good and evil tasted no better, looked no better than all of the other trees around them as all. Right? All the other apple trees and banana trees and orange trees and all of the stuff that was there, the tree of knowledge and good and evil, whatever fruit was on that, looked no better, tasted no better than all of the other fruit trees that were in the garden. Right? It was just the fact that Satan was trying to imply that fruit, that tree, had more importance than all of the other ones that were around. Satan never focuses on the privileges we have. Let me read this to you again. This is from Warren Wiersbe, right? Satan never focuses on the privileges we have, never focuses on all the beauties that we behold, never focuses on all the joys that we experience through God. He focuses on the restrictions. He focuses on the forbidden things, and he exaggerates them. And he exaggerates them to the point to suggest that God is mean or unfair for holding them from us. Right? We never see Satan talking about the fact that all the other beauty of creation that was around, right? He saw it too. He saw the animals that were there and the huge explosion of life that was there and all the beauty of majesty that surrounded the Garden of Eden. He saw all those things, but he never mentions to Eve about the beauty of creation God had given. He goes to the restrictions. He's trying to say that God is holding something back from us. Satan essentially divorced the restriction from God's holy character. Eating of the forbidden tree was not only wrong because God said it was wrong, but it was also wrong because it violated God's holiness. God gave them one rule: don't eat of it. That's it. It was the only rule. It was the only restriction. I've given you this entire creation. You have the entire earth here, right? The beauty of everything that I've given you. Just don't eat the fruit. It was the only restriction. Only thing he did. Only thing he told them to do. Satan takes that restriction and tries to minimize it and make it seem very small and very trivial. Are you really going to die if you eat that? Do you really think God just made all this stuff and then He's just going to kill you as soon as you eat that fruit? He doesn't want you to be like Him. He doesn't want you to see things like He sees things. When we see what God forbids as a list of restrictions, rather than a violation of His holiness, we open ourselves to temptation. Let me say that to you again. When we see the list of restrictions that God has given us, and we know what they are, right? When we see those as a violation of when we see those as a list of restrictions, rather than a violation of His holiness, we're going to open up ourselves to temptation. Eve confessed that one restriction existed. But when she did that, she misrepresented exactly what God said. She said the restriction included not touching the tree and that doing so would bring death. Right? Go to verse 3. But of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God hath said, ye shall not eat of it. And then she goes on to say what? Neither shall ye touch it, lest ye die. If we go over to verse 16 and 17 of chapter 2, and the Lord God commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden thou mayest freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, what does God say? Thou shalt not eat of it, for in that day that eatest thou shalt surely die. We see in verse 3, Eve says, God said that you shouldn't eat, nor should you touch it. Then you will die. For whatever reason, she was stating that the restriction, as Eve saw this fruit, played right into Satan's hand and into his plan. Okay? He got Eve to focus not on all the other trees, not on all the blessings, not on all the joy. He got Eve to focus just on one that was restricted. Immediately, Satan here progresses in his temptation, the methodology here, and how he tempts Eve by boldly stating that as soon as she eats the fruit, she won't die. And the serpent said, verse 4, unto the woman, you're not going to die. You really think God's going to kill you and allow you to die after all of this creation that's around? He didn't say that, but that's what he's implying here. You're not going to surely die. Obviously, here Satan is lying, right? Obviously lying straight to Eve's face, and we can plainly see that. We can read the account. We know that. But Eve bought into the lie. She believed the serpent must be her ally because she walked up to her and talked to her. After all, he was letting her in on some secret that God was withholding from her. Verse 5, for God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and you will be just like him. You shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. Satan always denies the consequences of disobedience. Satan will always deny the consequences of disobedience. The trouble with you, Eve, Satan here is basically saying, is that you are taking God a little too seriously. He doesn't really mean that when he says that. You're taking his words a little bit too literally. You're actually believing everything he says literally. Actually, Eve, what God is doing is God is just cheating you out of some stuff. He's keeping you from knowing some stuff. He knows that when you become a God, just like he is, then you'll know the stuff that he knows, and he doesn't want you to know what he knows. And Eve, you can picture this, still standing there in the garden, not close to the tree where she can touch it, but close enough to the tree that she can see it. And she's standing there continuing to listen to the serpent speak. Eve had been there too long, listened too long, hung around too long, stared too long at the fruit, and the more she looked, the more appetizing the fruit became. It looked good. It probably smelled good. It probably was very, very pretty. and eating it would be a very pleasant experience, and it would make her wise. Verse 6. And when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree to be desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit thereof and did eat, and gave unto her husband with her, and he did eat. Now, I'm going to stop right here for just a second, because this, the way that verse 6 is written, and the stuff that happens here, I honestly believe this is the very first time that Eve had looked at this fruit. Okay, if you go and look at verse 6, and the woman saw that the tree was good for food. I think that the parameters were set. When God put Adam and Eve in the garden, they were probably in the middle of it, and there was, or somewhere around where they could see all the trees, and God pointed out, eat everything you want. That one that's there, don't eat of it. I think Adam and Eve probably looked at it, recognized what tree that it was, and never thought another thing about it. Because if you see here in verse 6, Eve's out doing whatever she's doing, tending to the garden or whatever she may be doing. She's probably around the tree. Then she's probably not even thinking about the tree at all, right? Because we don't see any instance here of this whatsoever beforehand. This has probably never even crossed her mind. Because we get to verse 6 and the serpent shows up and he directs her attention to the tree. And we see some of the stuff that's written here in verse 6. When the woman saw that the tree was good for food, right? It was no different as far as the fruit as any of the other ones. This is just the first time she'd actually taken an instance to look at it. Because before this point, she knew better than to look at it. She knew not to even pay any attention to it because God said, don't eat of it. So, but when she took a second into the eyes and the tree and a tree to be desired to make one wise, the more she looked at the temptation, the more the fruit would be kind of like stuff would be kind of hearts would be coming off of it. It would be pulsating, and her eyes would be getting bigger. She looks at it. We can kind of see how this kind of happens, and she continues to stare at it. And desires to make one wise, she took of the fruit thereof and did eat, and gave also unto her husband, and he did eat as well. If you remain around the temptation long enough, your sinful nature will take the temptation. Eve, the moment she saw the tree, should have done what? Went the other way. But she kept looking, moved a little closer, and eventually she crossed the line. Guys, you know this, but let me reiterate this point. If you've been saved 3 years or 63 years, you flirt with sin, you flirt with the temptation, you try to dance on that line, you will always fall across it. And that fall will always be embarrassing. The temptation is there. When Satan puts it in front of you, go the other way. Some of you guys have been fighting temptations for 60-some years, right? Or however long you've been saved. And you know how this works. You know what Satan does. You know he puts the thing in front of you that causes you some problems. Does he ever quit doing it? No. Over and over and over again. He may change the method, but the temptation is always there because he loves to see Christians fall. Satan does not care about the unsaved people because they're unsaved. He wants to keep them that way. The best way to keep unsaved people unsaved is to take the light of the world and make it ineffective. He makes the light of the world ineffective by making our testimony ineffective. How do we make our testimony ineffective? Following after the temptations that he puts in our way. The line has been drawn. We know what's good. We know what's evil when it's coming to us or when Satan puts it up in front of us. And a lot of times, you guys know this, right? It's been a good season. It's been a good couple of months. The relationship's been great. You've been praying and you're in your quiet time and you feel like you're just getting closer and closer and closer to God and God's blessing you. There's a lot of stuff going on really good for you. You can just feel the presence of God in your life. You think that things are going really, really well. And then, boom, he shows up out of nowhere. And he puts the temptation in front of you. He puts the sin in front of you. He puts whatever it is in front of you because he wants you to fall. He wants you to be embarrassed. He wants you to be embarrassed of the fact that you fell for his trick again. I said this a lot of times from up here. I'm going to say it again. The most effective form of witness that we have is a daily walk with God that is faithful, that is strong, that doesn't heed to temptation. The best way He makes us ineffective is by allowing that walk to slide. He does that by showing up with the fruits in front of us over and over and over. Satan always denies the disobediences of the consequences of disobediences, and he goes then appeals to and appeals to our self-interest. He told Eve it's going to make her wise. He appealed to her self-interest, sensuality, and pride. The five senses and pride. How powerfully they make bad things look good to us. We see on down in verse 7 now. After now they've taken the fruit. I'm going to finish up with this. She's taken the fruit. She's eaten of the fruit. She goes to verse 6. Saw the tree was good for food. She then takes it to her husband. We get to verse 7. The eyes of them, as soon as they eat, the eyes of them both were open, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons. Intrigued with the unknown, Eve was tempted by the appetizing and visual appeal of the food, as well as the prospect of becoming wiser because of eating it. Her response to the temptation formed a pattern. We see in Genesis 3:6, we see the same thing over in 1 John chapter 2, verse 16. You don't have to turn on over there, but the avenues of temptation that are spelled out in 1 John, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life. We know those things. We've heard those things before. Those are the exact same ways in which Satan tempted Eve in Genesis chapter 3. He took the lust of the flesh. He took the lust of the eyes. He took the pride of life. That now becomes the pattern for which Satan tempts us every day, or in the exact same ways. Satan also tempted Christ through the exact same avenues, right? Matthew chapter 4 talks about the account. First 11 verses of it talks about the account. Of course, Christ was victorious over each of those temptations, but nonetheless, the pattern is there. The repetition of the avenues of temptation should tell you about the temptation that it has been the same since the beginning of time. Satan still appeals to us through the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. Just as Eve ate the fruit, then gave it to Adam, who also ate, humanity's problems then began with a disobedience to God's command. And because of that now, the process of death is underway. Go to Hebrews chapter 9, verse 27, and we'll finish up with this. And it is appointed unto me and once to die, but after this the judgment. That was the wrong one. Let's go to Ephesians chapter 2. Sorry, I had that wrong one marked. And you hath he quickened who were dead in trespasses and sins. The process here, the methodology that Satan used to tempt Eve is the exact same way in which he tempts us. When Eve took the fruit, Adam took the fruit. We see, of course, here the fall of man. The process of death now is underway. As we saw over in 1 Timothy chapter 2, there Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but woman be deceived was in the transgression. The implying here that Adam sinned knowingly, right? Not out of deception, which was the case for Eve. Eve was deceived by the serpent. When she brought the fruit to Adam, though, Adam knew which fruit it was. He knew what Eve had done, and he knowingly sinned as well. And that's why we see that the sin of Adam here, far worse. The Bible placed the guilt on Adam. The sin actually brought about the fall was because of Adam's sin, and we'll get into a little bit more of that next week. But the entire human race now, of course, from Romans chapter 5, verse 12, the entire human race, because of the sin of Adam and Eve, because of the temptation that they followed through, because of the original sin, the sin now is imputed on onto each and every one of us. The same temptation factor that Satan used on Adam that caused the sin to enter the world and the way in which it did is the same way in which he tries to tempt us as well, because he wants us to fall, right? He wants us to cross that line, to take a hit to our testimony, to take a hit of our effectiveness, of our witness as well. We'll finish up. We'll talk a little bit more about the fall next week. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for the lesson we've had, for the way in which Satan used the abilities that he had, and seeing Adam and Eve, who were the perfect creatures here, even being able to succumb to the temptation, should not allow us to think that we are above it either. That we also, Lord, if we stay long enough, if we stare long enough, if we look at it long enough, we're going to fall right into the temptation as well, and the consequences of sin that come because of it. So I pray, Lord, that as we have the temptation, as it shows up, Lord, you give us the ability and the desire to go the other direction. And I pray for Pastor Rob as he comes in the next hour, that you just continue to use him, Lord, in the mighty way he keeps attentive to the word this morning. In your name I pray. Amen.